Next up, Dr. Michael Scott is known to millions on our screens from TV series like Italy's Invisible Cities and Roman Britain from the Air.
But Viral History had great pleasure in talking to him about his other area of expertise.
Michael Scott, thank you so much for talking to us.
It's a pleasure.
What are you working on at the moment?
Well, right now I've sort of stepped back from my normal specialist field of the Greeks, and I'm actually taking a much bigger global view of the ancient world. I've got into global history, ancient world style. Now, we live in a globalized 21st century, we're constantly told that, yet that's not the way we think and study history. In fact, we do it in these bite-sized, silo-esque chunks, and we don't think enough, I think, about what each culture owed to interaction with others. And so my most recent work, it's come out in the book Ancient Worlds, is trying to sort of address that for the ancient world and look between the Mediterranean and China and look how there are developing threads, arteries, sinews, tissues of interconnection between the many different empires and worlds that existed across that vast geographical span from the sort of 6th century BCE through to the 4th century AD, and look at how those connective networks came into being. And they will eventually become a permanent part of the civilizations that live across that stretch. They're known as the Silk Roads, obviously. But my interest is not so much as what happens once those arteries are fully formed and functioning. My interest is kind of how do they actually come into being in the first place. I think it's about realizing that at the same time, across such a vast geographical span, so many different worlds are going through many of the same problems and issues, and putting them in parallel and actually starting to think about, okay, if we do that, what can we see that they're learning from each other? What are they gaining from their interaction with each other? But also for ourselves as historians, putting them side by side and comparing them, how do we better understand each of them as a result?
How much of a warlike people were the Greeks?
Oh, utterly warlike. They spent most of their time at war with one another, relatively little peace. They had fundamentally different ideas about how to govern themselves, about how to think, how to breathe, how to even go to war with one another. They disagreed on that as well. So war was a common currency, if you like. The Greeks were never a single people. They were a whole bunch of well over 1,000 different city-states and ethnic tribal groupings that spread out from the 8th century BC onwards from Greece, mainland Greece, across the Mediterranean with their different colonial foundations. And really when they searched for what brought them together, Herodotus is the famous Greek historian who claims that really the only things that brought them together were a common language, a common blood, and common customs, common religious customs in particular. Frankly, on everything else, they disagreed, and they spent most of their lives at each other's throats as well, at war with one another. The only time you can really start to talk about a unified Greece, and even then it's quite dodgy, is under sort of Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great, and then under Alexander the Great as he sort of creates, for such a brief period, a 10-year period before he dies, this mammoth empire stretching from Greece all the way to the shores of the River Indus in India. And after that, those people are touched by Greek culture for centuries to come. But are we going to call them Greeks? It is the unanswerable question.
Why was their civilization so important?
Crucially, because the Greeks are a moment in our kind of human story. They're a moment of incredibly intense creativity, a furnace, if you like, of invention. One of the most obvious to mention is democracy, direct democracy, born in 508 BC, not because the Greeks intended to give birth to democracy, but a byproduct of their kind of political angst and anger and rebellion. And what has happened as a result of that is that because Greece obviously then lent its ideas to Rome, and Rome has come to be such a formative part of Western Europe, we happily look back to the Greeks as a fundamental force in our civilization. There's a very famous quote by John Stuart Mill from the 19th century who said that as an event in British history, the Battle of Marathon back in 490 in ancient Greece is more important than the Battle of Hastings. And, you can only understand that, and that only makes any sense if you're thinking about Britain as a nation in the 19th century and still today that actively wants to be connected to ancient Greece and everything that it created.
And what legacy did the Greeks bequeath to the Romans?
The legacy of the Greeks, I think, is political and things like democracy. It's, in terms of art and architecture, an incredible array of styles of classical art and architecture that were copied in the Renaissance and which are all around us in the architecture of our world today. Also philosophical, and philosophy in many ways begins in the Western world with the Greeks as a way of thinking about key questions like what's justice, what's a just society, what does a just ruler look like, how do you live the good life, what is the good life? And also elements of our world that we still relish and cherish. The Olympic Games, I mean, just finished here in Rio in 2016, is an event that dates back to and tries to encapsulate the spirit of the ancient Greek world.
What are you working on next?
So we're just working on this book, doing global history, trying to put the ancient world into context a little bit more and see these different civilizations rubbing shoulder to shoulder with one another. And so I want to do some more of that and try and sort of understand better how these different civilizations interacted and what they owed to one another. But at some point I'm also going to be going back to the Greeks, and I want to start to think about how we can utilize every ounce of ancient evidence that we have to understand the experience of being in Greek, particularly sacred sites, religious sites. What do they smell like? What was the tactile feel of them? What was your experience of bewilderness or happenstance when you walked into one? I think there's lots more to be said and done to really get back into the footsteps of the Greeks.
Michael Scott, thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. Great to see you.